The first thing we can start doing is defining conflict, and I want to make a difference between constructive conflicts and destructive conflicts. Constructive conflicts, they happen when parents will disagree on something, when they might have accumulated some frustrations, unmet needs, and they will have a productive conversation around it, which is mostly calm, but emotions can be there, they can be expressed, but they'll mostly be said and maybe not like acted out on. And it's going to be clear that each partner is going into this conversation with goodwill and an intention to understand what the problem is, understand the perspective from the other parent, to try to clarify the situation and eventually lead to solve the problem, reach a satisfying compromise. By contrast, destructive conflicts happens when there's, for example, verbal violence. If threats are issued, if there's yelling, if there's name calling, if there's contempt that is shown, the other partner is being diminished, accused of a bunch of things. Same thing when there's physical violence involved, if there's hitting, for example, fights. And children will respond to this with a lot of distress and fear. When there's fighting in between parents, like it's typical to see children trying to be protective and trying to stop one or both of the parents from harming each other. The other type of things that tend to happen in destructive conflict is the silent treatment. So when parents are icing each other out. This can be especially difficult for children because there's a high level of tension in the family setting. They feel it, but nothing is being said and nothing's being addressed explicitly. That's a situation where we will see children trying to find a sense of control in the situation, and there's much more self-blame. They'll feel that maybe they're the problem, and they'll try to act accordingly in a hope to solve the conflict. The problem really happens when we're talking about like high conflict co-parenting. It means that it's the presence of ongoing destructive conflicts between the parents. These conflicts, repeated conflicts between the parents, will spill out and spill over their own parenting. There's a few different ways in which it can do that. It can lead to harsher parenting, so the parents might start shouting, criticizing, or even like hitting their children. That's one possibility. Another one is a more disinvested type of parenting. So the parent is completely overwhelmed with their own emotions and they won't be able to show much interest in the children, what they feel, their daily activities. It can also lead to a way of parenting that is more unstructured. So the routines that are normally in place either constantly change or they're not maintained. And it can also lead to a more intrusive type of parenting. Sometimes we can see a parent that will use their children as a confidant for around like what they're dealing with the other parent. So sometimes we'll talk about like even parentification where the roles are reversed. So all of a sudden, instead of being the parent who's going to take care of the emotional needs of the child, it's going to be the opposite, the child taking care of the emotional needs of the parent. Another type of intrusive parenting would be when the parents are trying to win their children over to their side. The most extreme representation of that would be what we call parental alienation, where the other parent is demonized, and the parent is trying to make the child choose who they're going to love most, and the other parent will be, that's a diminished and sometimes even like put away. Communication with the parent might be interfered with. One thing that for children that are exposed in a sustained way to destructive conflicts is that it will interfere with their capacity to regulate their emotions. So the first thing I think we need to remind ourselves is that children are especially sensitive. You know, when we say that they're like sponges, so they'll pick up on vibes, emotions, tensions that are happening, and especially between their parents. Because when you're a child, who do you look up to for reassurance, safety, and love? It's your parents. So understandably, if they're fighting, that is something that will be very acutely perceived and sensed by children. It goes without saying that it is very stressful for children to witness parents fighting. In terms of emotions, it can be a broad range, but usually we see it can be sadness, it can be anger, it can be anxiety, it can be, I think fear is a big one. Because again, if we think of children and their attachment to their parents, if they're fighting, it can bring up a bunch of, and I'll switch right away to the kind of thoughts and concerns that it can normally lead to, is that they can be very preoccupied about what will happen with the family. Does this mean that the family will break apart? And who's going to take care of me? Plus, if there's harm that's being done, there can be a lot of anxiety around, well, will I be next? Or is my parent okay? So that's in terms of emotions, in terms of thoughts. In terms of behavior, we're going to see some children will try to fight in the sense that they will try to solve the problem themselves. They might get protective if there's physical or verbal violence. Other children might be completely in avoidance and try to hide as best as they can when they hear those signs of conflict between their parents. Other might completely freeze and just be stuck in that mode. And others might fawn or try to appease the parents and do everything in their power to make everything calm again. So if you know a few things about trauma, like I've just listed the 4 typical responses to trauma, because being witness to sustained destructive conflicts can become traumatic. Being a child that grows up in a high conflict co-parenting setting, their capacity for emotional regulation will be undermined. And we can understand that because, again, the people who they would go to normally to feel safe and loved are actively fighting between each other. And like I said earlier, it might also make them less available to reassure their own children. What does it mean when your capacity for emotional regulation is undermined? Is that it tends to lead to different problems, including anxiety, depression, but also it might get expressed like through different behaviors. So children who grow up in those situations might start fighting more with their siblings and their peers. They might show up as being more defiant, and they might also want to damage objects and destroy things around them. Children that have been in those situations, there's going to be consequences while they develop, but also at later stages in life, including adolescence and adulthood. One of them is poorer social skill and competence. So having more difficulty with self-regulation and not necessarily having had healthy models in terms of conflict resolution leads to this situation where they might have a harder time with their own relationships. It also leads to poorer self-esteem and less trust in others because, again, they were exposed to a lot of fighting. So and not necessarily supported as best as children that have grown up in different circumstances. So they might get out of those developmental years with a sense of them being a bit more fragile and a sense of the world and others as hostile. And that can lead to different types of scenarios. Some people might become very avoidant of conflict altogether, but also of relationships so that it doesn't lead them into conflict. And some other people might also present as more aggressive. Understandably, if you see the world and other people as potentially dangerous, you might show up as more aggressive in order to protect yourself. We're also seeing consequences similar, like I've mentioned before, this is common with all types of trauma, impacts on physical health as well, both acute and chronic conditions. We can talk about like strokes, heart disease, digestive issues, fatigue, headaches. That is unfortunately common with people who have been through trauma, and that applies here as well. We also see how having grown up in those circumstances lead to disrupted sleep patterns. So more tiredness, like I've just mentioned, which might also impact school academic performance, which is also a consequence of having grown up in high conflict parenting situations. And the idea might be that indeed children are more tired, literally, but also probably more worried. So if you're both tired and worried about what's happening at home, what will happen tonight when you go back, understandably, you're less present for school. In some situations, though, we can see something like what I'm saying is not like it's not a direct automatic consequence. These are like heightened risks. Some children, we might see the opposite effect, especially if they feel responsible for the conflict, even though they're not. They might, in an attempt to gain some form of control over what's happening, they might overachieve at school in the hope, if only I'm doing good, if I'm perfect, things are going to be good again. And one thing that I nearly forgot to mention is that it is also associated with more risky behaviors, more self-destructive behaviors like smoking, drinking, substance use, and risky sexual activity. All of that being common with people who have a bit more of a hard time with self-regulation. First, I think that if their exposure to high-intensity conflicts can be limited, that's obviously good. I think for parents too, and I know it can be a challenge, but to try and maintain as positive of an image of the other parent as possible so that it doesn't lead to a conflict of alliance for the children, because that can be highly distressing for them. This feeling of having to choose, of feeling guilty if they choose one over the other, and it compromises how safe they can feel with their parents. And to also be mindful to not use your children as therapists for yourself as a parent, to ideally get that help from somewhere else so that you don't get these inverted roles, because that also compromises how a child can feel safe. All of a sudden, they need the support and they end up like having to provide it. But if there's one thing, and I think that's the most important point I want to make, is that children will need to have space with a safe adult, which can be one or two of their parents, but if they are too caught up in their conflicts and can't be available, it can be an auntie, it can be an uncle, a family friend, a teacher, a therapist, but a safe adult with whom they can process their feelings. And what I mean by that is that they have a space where they can express, say what they feel, so they can put words on those, and they have the support of an adult to normalize these feelings and to validate them. Because what we do know about trauma, like trauma is made up essentially of these two components, right? Of being in a situation that generates a lot of high intensity emotions and having control removed from you and being stuck there. So children who are witness to high conflicts and destructive conflicts between their parents are in such a situation. They didn't choose for that, and their control over that situation is very limited. But we also know that when we go through difficult experiences like that, if we have that space to put words, to express our emotions, put words on them and see them validated, it allows our emotions to move, and it doesn't necessarily lead to trauma, for that experience to turn into a traumatic experience.